She showed up at his door with a carpet bag, a spine made of iron, and a secret that could get her turned away before she ever spoke a word. Garrick Holloway had advertised for a cook. What he got was Evelyn Mercer, a widow who had buried her husband 6 months ago, ridden 3 days through early October cold, and hidden her infant son beneath a wool blanket in the wagon bed because she knew, with the bone certainty of a woman who had been turned away before, that the baby would cost her the job. She was right. And she came anyway. If you've ever watched someone bet everything they had left on a single door, stay with me. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The advertisement had run in the Laramie Courier for 11 days before Garrick Holloway tore it out of the paper and threw it in the stove. Not because he'd found someone, because he'd stopped caring whether he did. The ad had been simple enough. Cook wanted. Experienced. Room and wages. Inquire at the Holloway Ranch, 12 miles east of Denton Crossing, Wyoming territory. And it had drawn exactly the kind of responses a man learns to expect when he's been alone long enough to forget what company feels like. 2 letters from women who changed their minds before arriving. 1 man who showed up drunk and left the same way. A teenager from Cheyenne who took 1 look at the state of the kitchen and rode back out without untying his horse. The kitchen. Garrick hadn't thought about it much until the boy's face told him everything. Then he'd stood in the doorway and actually looked at the room. The grease-film stovetop, the cracked window patched with oil paper, the single tin cup sitting on the table like it had given up waiting for company, and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not shame, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to recognition. He was 41 years old. He ran a cattle and horse operation that had once been the envy of 3 counties. He had 8 men working for him. Good men, mostly. And a herd that had survived 2 brutal winters without catastrophic losses. By any measure that mattered in the Wyoming territory of 1888, Garrick Holloway was a man who had his affairs in order. The ranch ran. He just didn't live in it anymore. Not really. He'd pulled the ad from the paper on a Wednesday morning in late October, when the first hard frost had come down off the mountains and the sky had gone that particular shade of gray that meant the season was done deciding and had made up its mind. He'd put a pot of salt pork and dried beans on the stove, the same meal he'd made 4 times that week, and gone back out to work before the sun was fully up. He was in the south paddock mending a fence line when his foreman, a taciturn Scotsman named Dougal Fitch, rode over and said, "There's a woman at the house." Garrick didn't look up from the post he was setting. "Tell her the position's filled." "You filled it?" "No, tell her anyway." Dougal was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he disagreed but wasn't going to say so directly. "She rode a long way. Wagon looks like it barely made it." Garrick drove the post another 2 inches into the frozen ground. "A lot of people ride a long way for things they don't get." "Her horse is lame." He stopped, set down the mallet, looked up at Dougal, who had the good sense to keep his expression neutral. "Lame. Front left. Been compensating for a while by the look of it. She probably didn't notice until this morning." Garrick pulled off his gloves and stood up straight, his back registering its usual complaints about cold weather and hard ground. He stared out across the frost-whitened grass toward the distant shape of the ranch house and felt the particular irritation of a man whose day has just been rearranged against his will. "Fine," he said. "I'll talk to her." She was standing on the porch when he came around the side of the barn, and his first impression was simply that she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the journey. It was the kind of tired that settles into a person over months, maybe years. The kind that sleep doesn't fix because it isn't sleep you're missing. She was younger than he'd expected. Mid-20s, maybe. Dark hair pinned up under a gray wool bonnet that had seen better seasons. A coat that was adequate but not warm enough. She held herself straight, which told him something, and her hands were clasped in front of her, which told him something else. "Mr. Holloway," she said. Her voice was steady. "My name is Evelyn Mercer. I'm responding to your advertisement. Ad's not running anymore." "I know. I saw it 3 weeks ago, and it took me this long to get here." She didn't flinch. "I'm a capable cook. I can manage a kitchen of any size. I've worked in a boarding house, I've cooked for harvest crews, and I know how to put up preserves and stretch a food supply through winter. I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for work." He studied her. She met his eyes without looking away, which most people didn't do. Where are you coming from? Colby Station. Before that, Rawlins. That was nearly 4 days' ride in decent weather. In this weather, with a lame horse and a wagon that looked like it had been repaired with prayers and baling wire, it was something else. You have references? I have a letter from Margaret Forsyth in Rawlins. She ran the boarding house where I cooked for 2 years, and I have one from the pastor in Colby Station. She reached into her coat and produced 2 folded envelopes, which she held out to him. He didn't take them yet. Why'd you leave Rawlins? Something moved across her face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated. My husband passed. In April. There wasn't a reason to stay. I'm sorry for that. He said it because it was the thing you said, and because he meant it at least somewhat. He knew what it was to have the architecture of your life come apart in a season. He took the letters, read them both, standing there on the porch while she waited without fidgeting. The references were good. The Forsyth woman had written in a firm, practical hand about Evelyn's reliability and her skill with a wood stove, her ability to manage a kitchen budget, her calm under pressure. The pastor's letter was shorter and vaguer, the way pastors' letters tended to be, but its warmth was genuine. Garrick folded them and handed them back. The position is room and board and $12 a month, he said. You'd be cooking for me and whatever men are on the property, usually 8, sometimes more. Kitchen needs work. House needs work. He paused. It's not a comfortable situation. I'm not looking for comfortable, she said. I'm looking for honest work and a roof. He should have said no. He knew, standing there on that porch with the October wind coming down off the mountains, that taking on an unknown woman with a grief-worn face and a lame horse was not the straightforward solution he'd been hoping for. His ranch hands would have opinions. His life had achieved a kind of grim equilibrium that would be disrupted. He should have said no. I'll give you a week, he said. If it works, we can talk further. If it doesn't, I'll pay you for the days and have Dougal look at your horse. She nodded once. Her face didn't crack into relief or gratitude, which he respected. Thank you, Mr. Holloway. I'll need a few minutes to get my things from the wagon. I'll send one of the men to help. That won't be necessary. He turned to go, then stopped, because something in the way she said it, the precision of it, the determination, snagged at the back of his mind. He looked back at her. She was already moving toward the wagon, her stride purposeful in a way that didn't quite match the exhaustion in her face. He watched her lift something from beneath the wagon bench, something wrapped in a wool blanket that shifted and made a small, soft sound. He went very still. She turned and her eyes met his, and in that moment neither of them spoke. The thing in her arms, the bundle, the small living bundle, made the sound again, a murmur, an infant's sleepy complaint against the cold. Mrs. Mercer, Garrick said. His name is Noah. Her voice had changed. The steadiness was still there, but there was something underneath it now, something braced and raw. He's 4 months old. He doesn't cry much. He won't be underfoot. I'll keep him with me and he won't... You hit him. Yes. In the wagon. You left him in the wagon while you talked to me. He was warm. He was sleeping. Her chin came up slightly. I knew that if you saw him before you'd had a chance to hear me out, you'd turn me away. I've been turned away from 4 positions in the last 2 months because of him. I thought if I could show you what I'm capable of first, you lied to me. The word landed between them, and she didn't flinch from it. I didn't say anything false. I said I was looking for work. Everything I told you about my experience was true. You let me believe. I let you listen to me. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't apologize either. That's all I did. I let you listen to me before you decided I wasn't worth listening to. Garrick looked at the infant. The baby had turned its face toward him with the unfocused curiosity of the very young, dark eyes blinking slowly against the pale autumn light. A small fist had worked free of the blanket and was moving in that vague, purposeless way infants move, reaching for something or nothing at all. He thought about the empty house, the tin cup on the table, the salt pork that had been on the stove 4 times this week. This is not what I advertised for, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. A baby on a working ranch is a complication. I know it. I know exactly what it is. She didn't beg. That was the thing he noticed most. She stated the facts, and she held her ground, and she did not beg. I'm telling you, I'll work harder than whoever else you might find. I'm telling you, Noah won't interfere with the work. And I'm telling you that if you say no, I understand it, and I'll find another way. But I'm asking you not to say no without at least seeing what I can do. The wind cut through the porch. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and blew. Garrick Holloway was not a sentimental man. He'd buried his wife 7 years ago and built a wall around what remained of him, and he had every intention of that wall standing. He had not advertised for complications. He had not advertised for a widow with a 4-month-old and a lame horse, and eyes that looked at you like they already knew you were going to disappoint her. A week, he said again. His voice came out flatter than he intended. Same terms. If the men have a problem with it, that's the end of it. Her shoulders didn't drop with relief so much as settle, like a person who had been holding themselves at a rigid angle finally allowed to breathe normally. That's fair, she said. Dougal will show you the kitchen and get your horse seen to. He turned toward the barn. And Mrs. Mercer, yes, don't hide things from me again. On this ranch, if you have something to say, you say it. That goes for everyone. A pause. Understood. He walked away without looking back. Man, the kitchen was worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected it to be bad. The stove needed cleaning, the flue needed clearing, half the spice shelf was empty, and the flour barrel had a crack along the bottom seam that had let in moisture. The cutting board was warped. One of the pot handles had been replaced with a twisted piece of wire. The window let in a thin draft through its oil paper patch, and the cold pressed in around the edges of the back door like it was testing for weakness. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and took stock the way she'd learned to take stock, without emotion, without complaint, just inventory. What was here? What was missing? What could be fixed and what had to be worked around? Noah was in the small room off the kitchen that Dougal had pointed out as hers, a narrow space with a rope bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that faced east. She'd laid him on the bed with a rolled blanket wedged along each side, and he'd gone back to sleep with the enviable ease of an infant who had no opinion yet about where he was, only that he was warm and fed and not alone. She set water to boil because the first thing you do in an unfamiliar kitchen is get the stove working properly and see what you have to work with. While the water heated, she opened every cabinet. Flour barely enough, salt pork plenty, dried beans and cornmeal adequate, a good supply of lard, some early winter root vegetables in a crate under the counter, potatoes, turnips, 2 soft onions, a half-empty tin of coffee that smelled like it had been sitting there since spring. She found, pushed to the very back of the lowest cabinet, a small crock of molasses that was still good and a paper bag of dried apple slices. A person who knew what they were doing could work with this. She made supper. She made it the way she'd learned to cook. Not fancy, but right. A proper bean soup with the salt pork cut into it, cornbread baked in the cast iron that she'd scrubbed out until the old grease was gone, and a pan of stewed apples with molasses that she set on the table at the last minute because something sweet at the end of a cold day wasn't a luxury, it was just sensible. The men came in at 6 and stopped in the kitchen doorway in a loose cluster, the way men do when a room smells different than they were expecting. There were 8 of them, ranging from a boy who looked barely old enough to shave to a weathered hand named Cutter, who Dougal had told her had been on the Holloway spread for 12 years. They filed in and sat down, and there was a moment of the particular self-conscious silence that falls over working men who suddenly remember manners they haven't used in a while. One of them, young, freckled, with the kind of easy face that invites trouble, leaned sideways and said to the man next to him, in what he probably thought was a quiet voice, "She's younger than I figured." "She's right there, Emmett," Cutter said, not looking up. Emmett had the grace to look embarrassed. "Sorry, ma'am." "Eat before it cools," Evelyn said, and began ladling soup. Garrick came in last. He washed his hands at the basin and sat at the head of the table without comment, and the meal began. He ate slowly, the way a man eats when he's been eating alone and has forgotten that meals are sometimes more than refueling. She watched him without watching him, a skill she'd developed over years of working in rooms where she wasn't quite supposed to be noticed, and she saw the moment the cornbread registered. He didn't say anything. He just reached for a second piece, and something in the deliberateness of it told her more than a compliment would have. After supper, when the men had gone and she was washing up, Garrick appeared in the kitchen doorway. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and said, "Where'd you learn to cook?" "My mother, mostly. She ran a large household, then the boarding house. She didn't stop washing." "Why?" "That soup. You use the molasses and the beans?" "A spoonful. It cuts the saltiness of the pork and smooths out the bitterness." She glanced at him. "Most people don't notice." "I noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "The men will be up at 4:30, breakfast before 5. "I'll be ready." He nodded and pushed off the doorframe. He was nearly out of the kitchen when she said, "Mr. Holloway." He stopped. "What?" It wasn't quite a question. It wasn't quite an invitation, but it was an opening, and she was someone who knew how to use an opening. "The flour barrel has a cracked seam," she said, "and the window needs a proper pane before the real cold comes in. I can manage without them, but I thought you should know." He stood there a moment, his back still to her. "I'll have it seen to." "Thank you." He went. She finished the dishes, checked on Noah, who was still sleeping with the same uncomplicated peace he always brought to sleep, and stood for a moment in the small cold room that was hers for now, listening to the ranch settle into its night sounds. She was still here. That was the first thing. She was still here, and the soup had been good, and nobody had told her to leave. One day. That was all this was. One day down, and 6 more to prove that this was worth keeping. She sat on the edge of the rope bed, pressed her fingertips to her eyes for a moment, and breathed. Outside the window, the Wyoming dark was complete and moonless and cold, and the first serious snow of winter was still out there somewhere, building itself over the mountains, getting ready. She had a week. She intended to make it mean something. The week passed, and Garrick didn't bring it up. That was how Evelyn knew she was staying. He didn't say it directly. She was beginning to understand that Garrick Holloway didn't say most things directly. But on the 8th morning, when she came into the kitchen before 4:30 and found that someone had replaced the flour barrel overnight, she understood the conversation had already happened, just without words. The new barrel was solid pine, sealed tight, and sitting exactly where the old one had been. On top of it, someone had left a paper-wrapped parcel of dried herbs, sage, thyme, something she had to smell twice before recognizing as rosemary, without a note or explanation. She put the herbs on the shelf and started the stove and didn't mention it. The men had settled into a kind of cautious acceptance that was, in its own way, more honest than immediate warmth would have been. They were working men with opinions and habits built up over years, and a woman in the kitchen, a young widow with an infant no less, was not something any of them had been prepared for. Emmett, the freckled one, had taken to arriving at breakfast 5 minutes early and sitting at the end of the table closest to the kitchen door, which Evelyn suspected had less to do with appetite and more to do with the fact that Noah was usually awake at that hour, and Emmett, for all his big talk, was absolutely undone by the baby. He never asked to hold him. He just sort of positioned himself nearby and found reasons to stay. Cutter was harder to read. He'd been on this land longer than most of the others combined, and he carried that tenure like a kind of quiet authority that didn't need announcing. He wasn't unfriendly to Evelyn exactly, but he wasn't easy either. He watched her. Not in a threatening way, more the way a man watches something he hasn't decided about yet, reserving judgment until he has enough information. She respected that. It was, she thought, probably how she looked at most things too. The others fell somewhere in between. Tom, who was missing the tip of his left index finger from a fence wire accident, and who read dime novels when he thought nobody could see him. Holt, barely 19, who had a mother in Ohio he wrote letters to every Sunday, and who got embarrassed about it if anyone noticed. Birch and Cal, who had ridden together since somewhere in Colorado and communicated in a shorthand of gestures and half-sentences that the others had long since stopped trying to decipher. Dougal, who ran things with a Scotsman's combination of absolute practicality and deeply hidden feeling, and who had, Evelyn noticed, begun leaving small pieces of useful information at the kitchen door. The location of the root cellar, the days the supply wagon came through Denton Crossing, which of the horses was reliable and which was not, without ever formally offering them. She was learning the shape of this place, and slowly, carefully, it was learning her back. The kitchen was her territory now in a way the rest of the ranch was not. She'd fixed what she could fix herself and put in a request with Dougal for what she couldn't, and the results were incremental but real. The stove drew properly, The window had a new pane. The shelves were organized in a logic that made sense when you were in the middle of cooking and needed to find things fast. She'd discovered a garden bed on the south side of the house that had gone to weeds but had good soil underneath. And though the season was too late for planting, she'd cleared it and turned the earth and thought about spring. Noah adapted with the flexibility of the very young, which is to say he had no choice and didn't know it. He slept in the kitchen in a shallow wooden crate Dougal had lined with an old horse blanket, padded with a quilt Evelyn had brought from Rawlins, the one her mother had made, the one she would not have parted with for any amount of money. He woke, he ate, he regarded the world with his dark, unblinking eyes. He slept again. He had not, so far, been the disruption she'd promised he wouldn't be. She was careful about that. More careful than she probably needed to be, because she understood that the permission she'd been given was conditional in ways that hadn't been spelled out, and conditional things required maintenance. Garrett kept his distance in a way that was deliberate enough that she noticed it. He came to meals, he was civil at the table, he occasionally stopped in the kitchen doorway to ask a practical question about supplies, about what was needed, once about whether she knew how to put up venison, which she did. But he did not linger, did not make conversation for its own sake, and did not look at Noah if he could avoid it. That last part she'd clocked early. It wasn't hostility. It was something else, something she recognized without being able to name it exactly, the way you recognize a piece of music you heard once in a different life. She didn't push. She wasn't there to push. It was Emmett who cracked first, which surprised nobody. He'd been circling Noah for 2.5 weeks, getting a little closer each morning in the manner of a man trying to convince himself he was doing something casual. On a Tuesday in early November, when Evelyn was at the stove turning bacon, and Noah was on his back in the crate making the particular sound that meant he was in a good mood, Emmett came in 4 minutes early, sat down at his usual spot, and said to the room in general, "He's doing that thing with his hands again." "He does that a lot," Evelyn said, not turning around. "What's he grabbing at?" "Nothing in particular. Air, light, whatever he can see." She heard the familiar sound of Emmett's chair scraping slightly as he leaned forward. "You can pick him up if you want. He won't bite. He doesn't have teeth." Silence. Then, "I didn't say I wanted to." "I know you didn't." Another silence, longer this time, while the bacon sizzled and the morning cold pushed against the new window pane. Then she heard Emmett get up from the chair, heard his boot steps on the kitchen floor, heard the particular careful sound of a large young man attempting to be gentle with something that requires it. "Hey, little fella," Emmett said, in a voice she'd never heard from him before, soft and slightly ridiculous and entirely sincere. Noah made a sound back. Not words, just sound, but satisfied. "Huh," Emmett said. That was all. Just that. By the time the other men filed in for breakfast, Emmett was back in his chair. And if anyone noticed that his posture had changed slightly, less armor in it somehow, they were wise enough not to say so. The flour sack curtains she'd put up on the kitchen windows were Cutter's breaking point, though not in the way she expected. She'd made them on a rainy Saturday from 2 clean flour sacks, hemmed the edges, and hung them on a piece of wire she'd strung between 2 nails above the window. They were plain and modest and let in enough light while cutting the worst of the draft. She'd thought nothing more of it. Cutter stood in the kitchen doorway that evening and stared at the curtains for a long moment without speaking. Evelyn watched him out of the corner of her eye, ready to take them down if that's what was needed. She had no attachment to curtains. She had attachment to staying. "Margaret used to do that," he said finally. She waited. "Mr. Holloway's wife." His voice was even, but she heard the careful work in it. "She put curtains up everywhere. Said a room wasn't a room until it had curtains." He paused. "He had them all taken down after." Evelyn set down her spoon, turned to face him properly. "I didn't know." "I can take them down." Cutter looked at her for a moment, then at the curtains again. "No," he said slowly. "Leave them up." She would have wanted them up. He said it like a decision, like something he'd been considering for longer than this conversation. "She would have liked you, I think." She had no patience for people who felt sorry for themselves either. He left the doorway before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her spoon in her hand and the curtains moving slightly in the draft, and she felt the weight of the woman who had lived in this house before her. Not as competition or comparison, but as presence, as context, as something she needed to understand if she was going to understand any of this. She went back to cooking, but she thought about it. She didn't find out what she needed to know from Cutter or from Dougal or from any of the men. She found out from Garrick himself on a night in mid-November when the cold had gotten serious and she'd stayed up late making a second batch of bread because they'd gone through the first faster than expected, and she didn't want to be short in the morning. She heard him before she saw him, bootsteps that paused outside the kitchen, the hesitation of a man who has come downstairs for one reason and found the kitchen occupied and isn't sure how to handle it. She didn't look up from the dough. "I'm sorry if the light woke you," she said. It didn't. He came in and sat down at the far end of the table, not his usual seat at the head. He was in his work clothes still, though it was past 10, which told her he hadn't been to bed. He looked at the bread dough for a moment. "What time is it?" "Little past 10. He nodded. Didn't say anything. She kept working the dough because bread needed to be worked, and because silence with Garrick Holloway was not, she'd learned, necessarily uncomfortable. He seemed to think in it rather than fight against it. She was about to shape the loaves when he said, "Margaret died in November." She stilled her hands, just for a second. 6 years ago. Fever? He said it in the same flat register he used for most things, but she could hear the edges of it. "She was sick for 2 weeks. I thought she'd pull through. She'd always pulled through before." Evelyn turned the dough without speaking, giving him room. "The ranch fell apart after. Not the operations. The operations. I kept those together because I knew how to do that, and it was something to do. But the—" He stopped. "She was the reason it felt like something, not just land and cattle." "I know about that," Evelyn said. Quiet. Not comparing, just confirming. "Your husband. His name was Daniel." She shaped the first loaf with practiced hands, pressing the air out. "He was sick for a long time before he died. I knew it was coming. I thought knowing would make it easier." She paused. "It didn't." "No," Garrick said, "it doesn't." The kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the wind was doing its November work against the eaves, and Noah was asleep in the back room making the small, even sounds he made when the world had treated him well enough that day. Evelyn put the loaves in the pan and covered them with a cloth and turned around to find that Garrick was looking at the curtains. Not with grief exactly. With something more complicated than that. The way you look at a thing that costs you something and you're still not entirely sure what you think about paying it. "Cutter told you," he said. "He told me her name, that she liked curtains, that she was someone I would have gotten along with." She leaned against the counter. "I'd have taken them down, if you'd asked." "I know." He looked away from the curtains, back at the table. "Don't take them down." "All right." He stood up, scraped the chair back. He was leaving, which was what she expected, and she was already turning back to the counter when he said, "You're not what I expected when I put that advertisement out." She glanced back. "What did you expect?" He seemed to actually consider the question, which she appreciated. "Someone easier," he said finally. "Someone who wanted less." "Less what?" "Less—" He made a short gesture with one hand that didn't quite become a word. "Everything. You want less of less. Most people who are in a hard place, they want less trouble, less notice. You want the window fixed and the garden turned and the flower barrel replaced. You want to do it right. Is that a problem?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the most honest answer he could have given. He went to bed. She finished with the bread and banked the stove and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the residual warmth, thinking about two people trying to find their footing on ground that had given way under them and how different the shape of the same loss could look in two different people. The morning it all changed, or the morning she understood it was already changing, which is a different thing, started with a sound she heard from the kitchen window. Not an unusual sound at first. Wagons moved through the ranch yard regularly, deliveries and neighbors, and the general traffic of a working spread. But this one was moving faster than it should have been on the uneven ground near the barn, and something in the pitch of the wheels told her before she could see it that something was wrong. She was at the window in time to see it, the supply wagon from the Denton Crossing dry goods store. One of the horses having spooked at something, careening at a run on a line that would take it along the front of the barn. The driver was hauling back on the reins and shouting, and the men in the yard were scattering, and none of that was the thing that stopped her heart. The thing that stopped her heart was Noah. She'd laid him on a blanket near the barn entrance 20 minutes ago while she'd gone to ask Dougal about the week's supply list. She'd meant to be back in 10 minutes. She'd stayed 12. He was still there. She could see the pale shape of the blanket, and she was already moving. Through the kitchen door, across the porch, down the steps. But she knew with a cold and terrible certainty that she was not going to be fast enough. The wagon was coming at an angle that would take it within feet of where Noah lay, and the horse had its head and wasn't slowing, and even if the driver pulled it around, it would be close, too close. Then Garrick was there. She didn't see him come from anywhere specific. He was just suddenly in the path of the wagon, moving with the complete absence of hesitation that she recognized later as the difference between thinking and reacting. He crossed the distance to the blanket in 3 long strides, dropped to one knee, gathered Noah in one arm, and rolled clear of the wagon's path in a single motion that should not have worked as cleanly as it did. The wagon thundered past. The driver finally got the horse hauled to a stop 20 yards further on, the animal blowing and wild-eyed, the wagon sitting sideways in the yard with one wheel still spinning. Everything went quiet in the way things go quiet, after something loud and frightening, a held breath across the whole yard. Garrick was on one knee in the dirt with Noah against his chest, and for a moment he didn't move. Evelyn reached him and took Noah from his arms. Noah, who was not crying but who had the wide, startled look of a baby who has just experienced something outside his normal understanding of the world, and held him and checked him with shaking hands while her heart did things hearts do in the aftermath of terror. "He's all right," Garrick said. His voice was level, but his face wasn't, quite. There was something in his jaw, something in the set of his eyes that she hadn't seen on him before. "He's not hurt." "I know." She pressed Noah against her shoulder and breathed. "I know, I can see that." Her hands were still shaking. She could feel it. "I shouldn't have left him there. That was my fault. I shouldn't have—" "Evelyn?" He said her name like a full stop, like the period at the end of a sentence that needed ending. "He's all right." She looked at him. He was still on one knee in the dirt, and there was a tear in the elbow of his coat where he'd rolled on the ground, and his hat had come off somewhere, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not quite readable, but was more open than anything she'd seen from him in nearly a month. Noah reached out and grabbed a fistful of Garrick's collar. The grip of a 4-month-old is not strong. It could be removed with minimal effort. Garrick looked down at the small fist wrapped around the fabric, and he went very still in the way she'd noticed he went still when something caught him off guard internally, when the world did something he hadn't prepared a response for. He didn't pull away. He stayed there, on one knee in the dirt of the yard, with Noah's fist in his collar and the spooked horse still blowing somewhere behind him, and he let the baby hold on. Emmett appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. Is he, ma'am, is the baby?" "He's fine," she said. Her voice had steadied. "Go check on the driver." Emmett went. The yard began to breathe again around them, men moving, voices resuming, the business of the day reasserting itself. But for another moment, Garrick stayed where he was, and Evelyn stood where she was, and Noah maintained his grip on a man who had been very carefully holding himself apart from the world. "Thank you," she said. Garrick stood up, dusted off his knee, retrieved his hat from where it had landed. He put it on and looked at her with that unreadable expression for a moment longer. "Don't leave him near the barn when there are wagons expected," he said. "I won't." She paused. "Garrick." It was the first time she'd used his given name. He registered it. She could see that. "Thank you," she said again. He nodded once and went back to work. She stood in the yard with her son pressed against her shoulder, feeling the shape of something she couldn't quite name yet, something in the air of this place that had been cold and was now, slowly and unevenly and without any promise of staying, beginning to change. And that evening, when she brought supper to the table and Garrick sat down at the head of it, and Emmett took his usual spot near the kitchen door, and Cutter nodded to her from across the room, and Noah made his satisfied sounds from the wooden crate in the corner, She looked around at the table full of imperfect, difficult, particular men, and the warm kitchen, and the flour sack curtains moving in the draft. And she allowed herself, just for a moment, just briefly, to think the word home without immediately reminding herself why she shouldn't. He rode in on a Thursday, which Evelyn would remember afterward, not because Thursdays meant anything particular, but because she'd been in the middle of rendering lard and the smell of it clung to her the whole time, and there's a way certain smells attach themselves to bad memories and stay. She heard the horse first, not the easy sound of a ranch hand coming in from the pasture, but the deliberate, measured pace of a man who has decided how he wants to arrive somewhere and is executing on that decision. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked out the kitchen window. He was not a large man, which surprised her. She'd formed an impression of Barrett Kane over the previous weeks without ever having met him. His name came up occasionally in the men's conversation, always with a certain compression of tone, the verbal equivalent of a door being shut carefully rather than slammed, and she'd built a picture in her head of someone physically imposing. What she saw instead was a man of medium height and perhaps 50 years, dressed well enough for town in clothes that were slightly wrong for a working ranch visit, his horse a gray that cost more than most men in this territory made in a year. He had a thin face and the kind of stillness that wasn't calm so much as controlled, and two men rode behind him at a respectful distance, the way dogs stay close to a man they've learned not to get ahead of. He didn't knock. He tied his horse at the post and walked up the porch steps and opened the front door of the Holloway house and went in. And Evelyn stood in the kitchen and understood in the space of that one action exactly who Barrett Kane thought he was. She heard him in the front room, heard Dougal's voice, flat and unwelcoming, and then Barrett's, which was smooth in a way that made her think of ice on a water trough. Looked solid, wasn't safe to trust. She couldn't make out the words. She turned back to the stove and kept rendering the lard and waited, because the best thing she'd learned about situations she didn't have control of was to stay occupied and pay attention and not give anyone a reason to think she was afraid. Garrick was in the east pasture. One of the younger hands, Holt, had ridden out to fetch him as soon as the rider appeared on the property line. Dougal had seen to that without being asked, which told Evelyn he'd been expecting something like this, or something adjacent to it. She heard the front door again, heard the porch steps, and looked out to see Barrett Kane standing in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the ranch with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. His two riders sat on their horses and said nothing. A few of the hands had drifted toward the barn, not obviously, but positioned in the way that working men position themselves when they're watching something without wanting to look like they're watching. Garrett came in from the east at a canter and slowed to a walk as he crossed the yard. He dismounted and handed the reins to Holt without taking his eyes off Barrett, and there was something in the way he moved, no hurry, no visible tension, that Evelyn recognized as a different kind of control than Barrett's. Barrett's stillness was performed. Garrick's was simply what he was. She cracked the kitchen window open, half an inch. "Barrett," Garrick said. "Garrick." Barrett smiled in the way people smile when they want you to understand they don't need to. "Beautiful piece of land you've got. Always said so. Your herd looking healthy going into winter? What do you want?" Barrett glanced around the yard at the hands who were very busy not watching, at the house, at the kitchen window where Evelyn stood just out of sight. "I heard you took on a new cook, widow woman from up Rollins Way." He said it conversationally, the way you'd mention weather. "Evelyn Mercer." Garrick said nothing. Evelyn pressed closer to the wall. "Sad story, the Mercer situation," Barrett continued. "Daniel Mercer was a decent enough man, I suppose, for someone without much business sense. Borrowed against his future too many times. A man does that. Eventually the future arrives and there's nothing left in it." He paused. "His estate left a substantial debt. I've been patient about collecting, out of respect for the widow. But patience has practical limits, as I'm sure you understand." "How much?" $420. With the carrying interest since April, closer to $480. Evelyn's hands went flat on the counter. $480 was not a number that existed anywhere in the life she was actually living. It was a number from some other universe where Daniel had been someone different, someone reckless with money, which he hadn't been. She was certain of that. She had kept the accounts herself in Rollins. She had known every dollar that came and went. "That's a large number to arrive at without any prior notice," Garrick said. Mrs. Mercer was notified. I sent correspondence to Colby Station. She wasn't in Colby Station long. That's not my problem to manage. Barrett's voice hadn't changed at all. Still smooth, still measured. She has 30 days to satisfy the debt or make credible arrangements. After that, I'll be pursuing the claim through the county court. Whatever personal property existed in the Mercer estate that can be attached will be. He looked at the kitchen window again directly, which meant he'd known she was there the whole time. I understand there isn't much, but there's something. What she had was a carpet bag, a quilt her mother had made, a lame horse that was only now walking right, and $43 she'd saved since April. She'd done the arithmetic on her situation many times. She knew exactly what Barrett Kane was looking at when he looked at the kitchen window. Garrick's voice was even. I'll need to see the documentation. Of course. Barrett reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. Copies of the original loan agreements with Daniel Mercer's signature, the ledger entry from my accounting office. Everything in order, I assure you. He held it out. Garrick took it without looking at it. 30 days, Garrick. I'm sorry to bring this to your door. I know you've been kind to the woman, but a debt is a debt. He tipped his hat, got back on his gray horse with the ease of a man who is comfortable being looked at, rode out of the yard at the same measured pace he'd arrived, his two silent riders falling in behind him. The yard was quiet after he left. Not the ordinary quiet of a working ranch, but the particular quiet of a place where everyone is carefully not saying what they're thinking. Garrick stood with the envelope in his hand and stared at the space where Barrett had been. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, and she could not read his face from here, could not tell what he was making of it, and the not knowing sat in her chest like something heavy dropped from a height. She went back to the stove. She finished the lard. She made supper, because there was supper to make, and the men would be hungry, and she did not know what else to do with herself when the ground was moving. He came to the kitchen after supper while she was washing up and set the envelope on the counter beside the basin. I want you to read this, he said. Tell me what's wrong with it. She dried her hands, opened the envelope, read the documents inside slowly and carefully, the way Daniel had taught her to read contracts. Don't skim, don't assume, read the words that are actually there. The loan amounts are in Daniel's handwriting, she said after a while. Or close to it. Someone practiced. She turned the page. The signature on the second document is too clean. Daniel wrote with a leftward slant. This is upright. She set the pages down. And this final balance is wrong. Garrick looked at her. Wrong how? Daniel borrowed from Barrett Kane twice when we were still in Rollins 2 years ago. I know this because I managed our accounts. The first loan was $80, repaid in full by the following spring. The second was $140, repaid in installments over 8 months. She tapped the page with one finger. The outstanding balance when Daniel died was 0. We had no debt to Barrett Kane. I have the receipts. Silence. You have the receipts, Garrick said slowly. In the lining of my carpet bag. I sewed them in when I left Rollins because I didn't want to lose them. I didn't think anyone would. She stopped. She looked at the documents on the counter, at the careful practiced handwriting that was almost but not quite her dead husband's hand, and felt something cold and specific move through her. He changed the ledger after Daniel died. That's a serious accusation. I know what I paid, she said. I know because I paid it myself. Daniel was sick for 7 months before he died. I was the one writing the checks. I have every one of them. She looked up at Garrick. He waited until Daniel was dead and found someone to forge the documents and then waited 6 months to make sure I'd lost ground. And now he's here. Garrick picked up the documents and looked at them again. He was not a man who showed anger, obviously. She'd noticed that about him. His rage was a quiet thing, internal, revealed mostly in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands when everything else in him was moving. He set the pages down. Who else knows about the receipts, he said. Nobody. I didn't know I'd need them. You need them now. He looked at her. I want to be straight with you about something. Barrett Kane has influence in this county that goes beyond money. He's on good terms with the county commissioner and has been for years. A claim from a widow with $40 and no local standing against a man like Barrett, even with receipts, that's not an easy fight. I know. It could be expensive, a lawyer, court costs, time. He paused. I'm not telling you this to discourage you. I'm telling you so you understand what you're walking into. Evelyn folded the documents and put them back in the envelope. She was quiet for a moment because there were things building up in her that needed a moment's management before she could be useful to herself. Then she said, "He has money and influence and forged documents and 30 days head start. What do I have? Receipts and a witness account of your own bookkeeping. What else?" Garrick looked at her for a long moment. "Whatever I can do," he said, "for whatever that's worth." What it was worth turned out to be more than she'd been prepared for, and more than he'd been prepared to give, and neither of them understood the full cost of it until after the decision was made. He sold 2 horses the following Monday. Not ordinary horses. Evelyn didn't know enough about the ranch's specific economy to understand this at the time. She found out later from Dougal, who told her the way you tell someone about a thing that is done and can't be undone, and that you have complicated feelings about. The 2 horses were breeding stock, a stallion named Gray Ellis, and a mare called Red Patience, both of which Garrick had spent 4 years developing, both of which represented a significant portion of the ranch's future income. He'd sold them to a breeder in Cheyenne for $260, which combined with $200 he'd pulled from what Dougal delicately referred to as the Winter Reserve gave him enough to retain Thomas Aldridge, the only attorney in Denton Crossing who had any meaningful courtroom experience. Evelyn found out about the horses the same evening Dougal told her, which was the same evening she looked out the barn window and saw the paddock where Gray Ellis and Red Patience had been standing empty in the gray November light. She went to find Garrick. He was in the tack room, which was where he went when he was doing something with his hands and not wanting to be found, and she stood in the doorway and said, "You sold them." He didn't look up from the bridle he was working on. "Yes." "Those were your breeding animals." "I know what they were." "Garrick." She waited until he looked at her. "I cannot let you do that. I won't let you undo 4 years of work on my account. Take the money back. Tell the man in Cheyenne the sale was a mistake. The sale is done." His voice was final without being hard. "Aldridge is already retained. We meet with him Friday. I'll find another way to pay for it. I have $43. I can find work in Denton Crossing. I can..." "Evelyn." He set down the bridle, turned to look at her fully. "I want you to listen to me, not because I'm the one who decides things for you. I understand that I'm not, but because I need you to hear this." He paused. "What Barrett Kane is doing is not only about you. I've been watching him operate in this county for 11 years. He does this. He finds people who are isolated and in trouble, and he picks the moment when they're least able to fight, and he moves on them. He did it to a farming family named Pruitt 4 years ago. He did it to a Mexican sheep herder named Castillo before that. He picks people he's calculated will not be able to push back." He held her gaze. "I am not spending that money for your benefit. I'm spending it because I have had enough of watching Barrett Kane do this to people, and I finally have a case that can be challenged." She looked at him for a long time. "That's a good reason," she said finally. "I think so. It doesn't make me feel better about the horses." "You don't have to feel better about the horses. You just have to let me do this." She looked away at the empty paddock visible through the tack room's small window. "I'm going to pay you back, every cent. We'll discuss that when the time comes." "I'm not discussing it. I'm telling you." He almost smiled. She saw it. The slight compression at the corner of his mouth that was as close as he usually got. "All right," he said. "Then we don't need to discuss it. Tasum." The reactions from the men came in ways she hadn't anticipated. Cutter was the most direct. He found her the next morning in the kitchen and said without preamble, "He sold those horses." "I know. Gray Ellis alone was worth..." He stopped himself, looked at the stove, back at her. "You didn't ask him to." "No." Cutter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Barrett Kane ruined a man I know. Good man. Had a small operation east of Denton. Barrett came in with a paper claim. Man didn't have the money to fight it. Lost his land." He picked up his coffee cup and held it with both hands. "Garrick's been angry about that for 3 years. You should know that. You're not the reason he sold those horses, but you're the reason he finally had somewhere to point it." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she put a second piece of cornbread on his plate, and Cutter took it and sat down. And that was, apparently, everything that needed to be said. Emmett reacted differently, which was to say he went around for 2 days being louder and more aggressively cheerful than usual, which was how he processed things that worried him. On the third day, he came into the kitchen and said, "Kane's got friends at the courthouse. You know that, right?" Garrick told me. "Aldridge is good, but he's one man." Emmett looked down at his boots. I want you to know that whatever happens, the men, we all—" He made a broad, inarticulate gesture with one hand. "You know." "I know," she said. "Thank you, Emmett." He looked deeply relieved to be done with that and went back outside. She'd been meeting every night for 2 weeks with Thomas Aldridge's notes by lamplight when she found the thing that changed everything, though she didn't understand immediately what she'd found. She'd pulled her receipts from the carpetbag lining, all of them, everything she'd carefully documented over 2 years of managing the Mercer household accounts. And she'd been going through them methodically, cross-referencing against Barrett's forged documents, building the clearest possible picture of where the numbers diverged and why. She had a good head for figures. Daniel had always said so. She'd kept their books because she was simply better at it than he was. And she'd kept them the way her mother had taught her. Clean, dated, every transaction noted with a brief description. It was the date discrepancies she noticed first. Barrett's ledger showed a loan made to Daniel Mercer in February of 1887 in the amount of $200. Evelyn had no receipt for this loan because she was certain it had never occurred. But the date made her go back through her own records with different eyes, and what she found there made her set down her pen and sit very still for a moment. In February of 1887, Daniel had been in hospital in Rawlins for 11 days with a lung complication. She had a receipt from the hospital, she'd kept it for the insurance documentation, dated February 3rd through February 14th. The loan in Barrett's ledger was dated February 9th. Daniel could not have signed a loan document on February 9th. He'd been unconscious for most of February 9th. She'd been there. She sat at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night with the hospital receipt in one hand and Barrett's forged ledger in the other, and she felt something shift in her chest that was not quite hope, but was the solid thing underneath hope, the thing hope needs to stand on. She needed a witness who had been at that hospital. She needed someone who had seen Daniel's condition and could testify to it. She needed the hospital's own records. She needed something else, too. Something she couldn't name yet, but could feel at the edges of her thinking. The sense that a fraud as organized as Barrett's wouldn't exist only in one ledger, wouldn't touch only one victim, wouldn't leave only one trail. A man who did this to the Mercers and the Pruitts and the Castillos and whoever else Cutter hadn't mentioned. A man like that kept records, kept them carefully. And sometimes, somewhere, those records existed in places he hadn't thought to clean up. She put the documents in order and went to bed. She lay in the dark with Noah's breathing filling the small room, steady and unconcerned as only a baby's breathing can be. And she thought about a retired county clerk that Aldridge had mentioned in passing last Friday. An old man named Gideon Marsh who had worked the county records office for 31 years, and who Aldridge had described as sharp as a new nail and twice as unpleasant. She thought about what a man like that might remember. After 31 years of watching documents pass through a county office, about a man like Barrett Kane. Outside, the Wyoming winter had gotten fully serious. Snow against the windows, wind in the eaves, the kind of cold that wanted to come in and stay. She'd spent her first weeks here worried about enduring it. She had stopped thinking about enduring anything. She had started thinking about winning. But the thing about a fight you don't fully control is that it doesn't stop moving while you're planning for it. And what she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Barrett Kane had not simply come to Garrick Holloway's ranch to deliver a legal notice. He'd come to take the measure of what he was dealing with, the way a careful man checks the depth of a river before he decides how to cross it. He'd taken his measurement, and what happened next was going to depend entirely on whether what he'd found made him careful or made him reckless. She'd find out which, soon enough. Gideon Marsh lived 3 miles outside Denton Crossing in a house that looked like it had been arguing with the weather for 40 years and was currently losing. The porch sagged on one end, the chimney had a crack patched with river clay, and the yard was a collection of things that had been useful once and might be again if a person were patient enough. He was 73 years old, walked with a cane he'd carved himself from a piece of ironwood, and received visitors with the particular hospitality of a man who had learned to be suspicious of people who wanted things from him. Aldridge had warned them. "He'll make you earn it," the lawyer had said. the evening before they rode out. Don't rush him, don't flatter him, and for the love of everything, don't tell him what you want before he asks. He spent 31 years watching people try to work him. He knows every angle there is. Garrick drove the buckboard. Evelyn sat beside him with Noah bundled against the December cold, her carpet bag between her feet, the hospital receipt and the forged ledger copies folded inside her coat against her chest. The morning was iron gray and still, the kind of cold that didn't move or gust but simply pressed, and the road to Marsh's place was rutted from the last freeze. They didn't talk much on the way out. That was something she'd come to understand about Garrick. He was not a man who filled silence because silence was uncomfortable. She'd stopped filling it herself about 2 weeks in, and somewhere in that mutual quiet they'd arrived at a kind of ease that was more honest than most conversation. Marsh answered the door before they knocked, which meant he'd been watching through the window, which meant Aldridge had told him they were coming whether he'd admitted it or not. He was a small man, dried out by age to something compact and durable, with eyes that were pale gray and entirely alert. He looked at Garrick, then at Evelyn, then at Noah, then back at Evelyn, all in the space of about 3 seconds. "You're the widow," he said. "Evelyn Mercer," she said. "Thank you for seeing us. I haven't done anything yet." He held the door open and stood aside. "Come in out of that cold. I've got coffee that was hot an hour ago, which means it's probably still drinkable." The house inside was not what the outside suggested. The inside was organized in the particular way of a man who had spent decades managing documents. Everything in its place, labeled, cross-referenced, a logic to the arrangement that was invisible until you looked for it, and then suddenly obvious. Books on shelves sorted by subject. Papers on the desk in stacks that were not random. On the far wall, a long wooden filing cabinet with small brass handles that had been polished recently. Marsh set 3 cups on the table without asking and poured coffee that was, as promised, merely warm. He sat down across from them and folded his hands and said, "You want to know about Barrett Kane's business in this county." "We want to know what you know," Garrick said. "That's a broader question than you might want to ask of a man my age." Marsh looked at Evelyn. "Aldridge said you have documents." She laid them on the table, the forged ledger copies, her own receipts, the hospital record. She walked him through it the way she'd practiced, clean, sequential, no extra language, just what she had and where it contradicted what Barrett had filed. Marsh listened without interrupting, which she was grateful for because interruptions made her lose her thread, and then he sat for a long moment looking at the documents with his pale eyes and didn't say anything. "The February 9th date," he said finally. "He was in hospital. I have the record." "I can read." He picked up the hospital receipt and held it closer to the window light. "I know this hospital. I know their record keeping. If they say he was admitted on the 3rd and discharged on the 14th, they mean it. They were meticulous." He set it down. "Barrett Kane has filed 7 debt claims in this county in the last 6 years. Did Aldridge tell you that?" "He mentioned some. 7. 4 settled before court, which is to say the people being claimed against either paid or disappeared. 2 dismissed for insufficient documentation, which cost Barrett something and made him more careful. 1 ruled in his favor, a farming family named Pruitt, judgment of $312. They lost their East Field." He picked up his coffee and drank some of it without appearing to register the temperature. "I spent 31 years in the records office. I saw every one of those filings. And I'll tell you what I told nobody at the time, because at the time I was a county employee and it wasn't my place to editorialize." He paused. "The documentation on those claims got progressively better, more detailed, more difficult to challenge, which is what a man's paperwork looks like when he's been doing something long enough to learn from his mistakes." "He's been practicing," Garrick said. "He's been refining." Marsh set down his cup. "The Pruitt claim. That one sat wrong with me. The Pruitt boy, youngest son, name of William, did some work for the records office one summer. He came to me after the judgment and told me his father had paid that debt, said he'd watched his father write the check and hand it over. I had no way to verify it. Barrett's ledger was clean." He looked at Evelyn steadily. "If you have receipts showing repayment, and if the hospital record shows the February loan was impossible to sign, you have something. But you need more than something. You need something that makes the judge look at Barrett's entire operation, not just this one claim." "The old ledger," Evelyn said. Marsh looked at her. "Before he refined the documentation," she said carefully, The earlier claims. The ones that didn't go smoothly. You said 2 were dismissed for insufficient documentation. What was insufficient about them? A pause. Marsh's pale eyes had something in them now that hadn't been there before. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of interest. The account entries in those early claims showed discrepancies in the running balance. Small ones. The kind a man might make if he was altering figures by hand and didn't catch every compounding calculation. What happened to those filings? County Records Office. Everything filed in this county goes to county records. He was quiet for a moment. I retired 8 months ago. I spent 31 years in that office, and I kept meticulous records of the records, if you follow me. Certain documents that I considered to be of particular significance, I noted the location and the date, and a brief description in a personal ledger I kept separate from official records. He paused. I am not telling you that I removed any county documents. I am telling you that I know where things are. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a gust finally came up and pushed against the patched chimney, and the fire in the iron stove shifted and settled. Mr. Marsh, Evelyn said, will you testify? Marsh looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze the way she'd learned to hold Garrick's. Not defiantly, not pleadingly, just directly, letting him see what was actually there. I'm 73 years old, he said. I've watched Barrett Kane use this county like a private instrument for the better part of a decade. I stayed quiet because it was not my position to act unilaterally on suspicion. He glanced at Garrick. You sold those breeding horses. Garrick said nothing. Aldridge told me. Said you pulled the winter reserve to make up the difference. Marsh looked back at Evelyn. That's either very foolish or very principled. In my experience, those two things are not always distinguishable. He picked up his cane from where it leaned against the table and stood up slowly. Come back Thursday. Bring Aldridge. I'll have what I have organized, and we'll discuss what can be used and what can't. Evelyn let out a breath. Thank you. Don't thank me. I have grudges of my own in this. Let's be honest about that. He moved toward the door and held it open. That baby been quiet this whole time. He's asleep. Marsh looked at Noah for a moment with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to babies but could recognize a peaceful one. Good, he said. Let him sleep. And that was how the meeting ended. The hearing was set for December 19th. The 2.5 weeks between Marsh's house and the courthouse were the kind of weeks that either forge people or break them, and there were moments Evelyn wasn't entirely sure which it was going to be. She made quilts at night. She'd started it the first week after Barrett's visit as a way to keep her hands busy while her mind worked, and she'd kept at it because the quilts were saleable, and she had made herself a promise about Garrick's money that she intended to keep. By the time December arrived, she had 4 finished quilts and 2 more in progress, and Dougal had taken them to the dry goods in Denton Crossing without being asked and come back with $14 that he set on the kitchen counter and did not discuss. During the days, she cooked and managed the household and did what had become her ordinary work. Because the ranch did not pause for legal proceedings, and 8 men still needed feeding and the winter stores still needed managing. She was glad for the ordinary work. It was the thing that kept the waiting from becoming unbearable. Garrick rode to Denton Crossing 3 times in those 2 weeks, twice with Aldridge, once alone on business he didn't explain and she didn't ask about. He came back from the 3rd trip with something different in his face, not quite settled, not quite the opposite. She was at the stove when he came in, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he said, I talked to William Pruitt. She turned around. The youngest son. He lives in Denton now, clerks at the land office. He came in and sat down, which he'd started doing more often in the evenings. Not long visits, not conversations with a clear purpose, just a presence in the kitchen that she'd stopped finding surprising. He saw his father write that check. He knows the handwriting. He knows the date. He was 15 years old, and he remembers it because his father made a point of doing it in front of him. Said he wanted William to see what it looked like to settle a debt properly. He paused. He's willing to testify. That's the Pruitt claim from 4 years ago. That's not our claim. It's a pattern. Aldridge says if we can show Barrett did this to one other family with documentation, it changes how the judge reads our case. It stops looking like a disputed debt and starts looking like a method. He looked at her. Marsh found the original ledger entries from those first 2 dismissed claims. The calculation errors are there. Aldridge thinks it's enough to put the whole operation under scrutiny. Evelyn set down her spoon. She thought about what that meant. Not just for her, not just for the $43 and the forged loan and Daniel's name on a document he hadn't signed. For the Pruitts, for the Castillos, for whoever else was out there with a debt they couldn't account for. "How is Aldridge feeling about it?" she asked. Garrick was quiet for a moment. He said he's cautiously optimistic, which for Aldridge is practically a celebration. The corner of his mouth moved. He also said that if Barrett brings his own legal counsel, which he will, we should expect a difficult morning. I've had difficult mornings. I know you have. He said it simply, without irony, and she understood he wasn't minimizing it. He was just agreeing. So, the night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to Noah breathe, and went through every document in her head, every date, every figure, every piece of testimony Aldridge had prepared them for. She'd been through it so many times it had stopped feeling like preparation and started feeling like something she was doing to stop herself from thinking about what it meant if they lost. If they lost, there was no appealing to a second judge. If they lost, Barrett had his judgment and he had legal authority to pursue the collection, and what Evelyn had available for collection was a carpet bag and a quilt and a horse that was finally sound. And she would need to leave the ranch, leave Denton Crossing, start again somewhere that hadn't been already closed to her. She sat up in the dark, put her feet on the cold floor, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and went to the kitchen, because the kitchen was the room in this house where she had agency, where things made sense in the particular way that familiar work makes sense. Garrick was already there. He was at the table with a cup of something, coffee, probably cold, and the lamp turned low. He looked up when she came in and said nothing, which she appreciated. She put the kettle on, sat down across from him. "You're also not sleeping," she said. "I sleep badly in December," he said. "Always have." She thought about Margaret, about November, and fever, and 2 weeks that ended wrong. She didn't say it. "I keep thinking about the horses," she said instead. He looked at his cup. "Don't. I can't help it. You had 4 years in those animals, and you sold them in a day. I sold them for a reason I believed in. That's all there is to it." He looked up. "I want you to stop carrying that. We can deal with the money when the money is what we're dealing with. Tomorrow, we're dealing with something else." She wrapped her hands around the mug she'd found and looked at him across the table. In the low lamplight, with the cold pressing against the new window pane and the ranch quiet outside, he looked like something she hadn't had a word for in a long time. Not uncomplicated. He was not that, and she didn't want that. Just present. Solidly, quietly present. "What happens if it doesn't go our way?" she said. He didn't answer immediately, which she respected. He thought about it. "Then we figure out the next thing," he said. "That's what you do." "You know I might have to leave." "I know that's one possibility." His voice was even. "I'm working on the assumption that it isn't the one that happens." "Garrick." "Evelyn." He said her name the way he'd said it in the yard after the wagon, like a full stop, but gentle. "I'm aware of everything you're about to say. I'm aware that this is your fight and not mine to solve, and that you don't want to be someone's problem. I've noticed all of that." He paused. "I'm also a man who has spent 6 years being very careful about what he lets himself want, and I've recently become less patient with that particular habit." He looked at her directly. "So let's just get through tomorrow, and then we'll talk about what comes next." She held his gaze. Outside, the wind did something quiet against the eaves, and Noah made a small sound in the back room and settled again. "All right," she said. They sat there for a while longer, not talking, the lamp burning low between them, until the cold got serious enough that going back to bed made more sense than staying up. She slept finally and didn't dream. The Denton Crossing Courthouse was a 2-story building of yellow limestone that served also as the county land office, and on Fridays as the location of the justice of the peace. On December 19th, it was full before 9 in the morning, which told Evelyn that Denton Crossing had been waiting for this with interest. She had not expected so many people. The room held perhaps 60, and it was at capacity, with people standing along the back wall. She recognized faces she'd seen in town: the dry goods proprietor, the woman who ran the millinery, Aldridge's clerk, a handful of ranchers she'd seen at the supply store. William Pruitt was near the front, young and pale and visibly nervous, in a coat that was too large for him. Gideon Marsh sat in the second row with his ironwood cane across his knees and his pale eyes pointed forward. Barrett Kane sat at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer named Carver, who had ridden up from Cheyenne and who wore his suit with the specific confidence of someone who rarely appeared before county judges and knew it. Barrett himself was composed, almost relaxed, which Evelyn understood as a calculated choice. He nodded to two men she didn't recognize when they came in. He did not look at Evelyn. She sat at the defendant's table beside Aldridge and put her hands flat on the wood in front of her, and she breathed. Garrick sat directly behind her. She knew without looking because she could feel it, the specific gravity of a person who is entirely focused on something and putting everything they have into the effort of staying still. Judge Harold Crane was 60 years old, heavy-set, with a gray mustache that he appeared to have grown at some point and then forgotten about. He did not look impressed by the crowd, or by Carver's Cheyenne suit, or by anything in particular. He sat down, arranged his papers, and said in a voice that had done this many times and knew it, "This is the matter of Kane versus Mercer, claim of debt in the amount of $480 against the estate of the late Daniel Mercer. Let's begin." Bat Satu Ubos Garmaraya. Carver opened first. He was good, organized, confident, with a presentation that moved cleanly from the original loan documents to the outstanding balance to the legal basis for the claim. He was the kind of lawyer who made complicated things sound simple, which was a skill, and he exercised it well. Barrett sat beside him with his hands folded on the table and his expression appropriate to a man who had been a patient and reasonable creditor, which was, Evelyn thought, an impressive performance. When Aldridge rose, he did not try to match Carver's smoothness. Thomas Aldridge was a county lawyer with ink-stained fingers and a direct manner, and he presented the counter-evidence the way he did most things, without decoration, letting the facts carry their own weight. The hospital record first. He read the dates into the record and called the Rollins Hospital administrator, who had, at Aldridge's request, sent a signed affidavit by post to establish that Daniel Mercer had been admitted February 3rd and discharged February 14th. The loan document filed by Mr. Kane's office is dated February 9th, Aldridge said to the room and to the judge. The defendant was physically incapacitated on that date. The signature is not valid. Carver objected that the affidavit was not live testimony. Crane noted it and moved on. Aldridge called Evelyn. She'd been over this with him 4 times. She knew what he was going to ask, and she knew how she was going to answer. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the back of the room, at the limestone wall, and answered each question the way she'd practiced, directly, specifically, without volunteering anything beyond what was asked. Her account of the payments, the receipts, submitted into evidence, each one dated and corresponding to an entry in her own bookkeeping record. The final balance at the time of Daniel's death, 0. Carver's cross-examination was pointed. He questioned her record-keeping, her memory, the possibility that Daniel had made financial arrangements she wasn't aware of. He was skilled at this part, making doubt feel like reason, making a widow's testimony feel like understandable wishful thinking. "Mrs. Mercer," Carver said, in a voice calibrated to sound sympathetic, "is it possible that your husband had debts he chose not to share with you? That men sometimes manage their financial affairs privately, particularly when they're unwell?" She looked at him. "Daniel and I managed our accounts together from the first month of our marriage. Every dollar in and every dollar out. There was not a financial decision made in that household that I wasn't part of." She paused. "And I have the receipts." Carver moved on. Aldridge called William Pruitt next. The boy's voice was unsteady at first, found its footing about halfway through, and by the end was clear and specific. He had watched his father write a check to Barrett Kane in the amount of $312, in full settlement of the debt Barrett had claimed. The date. The amount. The room where it had happened. The fact that his father had wanted him to see it done right. The ripple through the courtroom was quiet but real. Evelyn felt it. Then Aldridge called Gideon Marsh. Marsh walked to the witness chair with his ironwood cane, sat down with the deliberateness of a man who had all the time he needed, and looked at Judge Crane with his pale eyes and said, Before anyone had asked him a question, I spent 31 years in this county's records office. I know where every document is that's been filed in that time, and I know what healthy record keeping looks like and what altered record keeping looks like. I'm prepared to tell this court what I know. Crane looked at him for a moment. Mr. Marsh, we'll follow the standard procedure. Mr. Aldridge will ask you questions. Of course, Marsh said serenely. What followed was 40 minutes of testimony that dismantled Barrett Kane's operation the way you dismantle a poorly built fence, post by post, in order, each one coming out clean and leaving the structure less able to stand. The calculation discrepancies in the two earlier dismissed claims, the pattern in the documentation that got more sophisticated over time, the running balance alterations that showed up as small, rounding errors to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, and as clear evidence of manual manipulation to anyone who did, Carver objected repeatedly. Crane sustained some and overruled others. The courtroom was very quiet. Even the people standing along the back wall had stopped shifting their weight. Barrett Kane's expression did not change. That was the thing Evelyn kept coming back to. In the pauses between testimony, his face was still composed, still appropriate, right up until the moment it wasn't. The moment was when Marsh produced, from a folder Aldridge had submitted into evidence, a copy of the original ledger entry from the first Kane claim 6 years ago, the one with the uncorrected calculation error, alongside the updated version filed 2 years later in the Pruitt case, where the same type of entry appeared with the error resolved. These are the same accounting hand, Marsh said. I'm not a handwriting expert, but I spent 3 decades looking at documents. These entries were made by the same person. The only thing that changed between them is that the arithmetic is correct in the second one. He set both pages down on the rail. A man doesn't learn to do his arithmetic better unless he's been doing it wrong and noticed the problem. Carver said, Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating. He's testifying to his professional observation, Aldridge said. Crane looked at both of them. I'll hear it. He looked at Marsh. Continue. Barrett Kane, for the first time, leaned to say something in Carver's ear. Carver's expression, just briefly, showed something that was not quite confidence. Crane heard closing arguments. He did not deliberate for long. When he came back to the bench, the room was so quiet that Evelyn could hear Noah, who Emmett had come to hold in the back row, making small contentment noises in the warmth of the crowded room. The claim of Kane versus Mercer is dismissed, Crane said. His voice was level, but there was something in it that was not neutral. The documentation presented by the plaintiff contains fundamental inconsistencies that this court cannot overlook. The defendant has provided credible evidence of repayment, corroborated by third-party testimony. He looked up from his papers and out at the room. Furthermore, the testimony and evidence presented today raises significant concerns about a pattern of fraudulent debt claims originating from the same source. I am referring this matter to the county prosecutor's office for review. The financial records submitted by Mr. Aldridge will be held as exhibits pending that review. He looked at Barrett directly. Mr. Kane, this court is putting you on notice. The prosecutor's office will be in contact. Barrett said nothing. His face had arrived, finally, at something other than composure. Not fear, not quite, but the look of a man who has miscalculated the distance between where he is and where he thought he was. Crane banged his gavel. We're adjourned. The room came back to life all at once. Voices and movement and the scrape of chairs, and Evelyn sat at the defendant's table for a moment and did not move. Aldridge was saying something to her, something about the next steps with the prosecutor's review, something practical and important that she would need to engage with. And she understood all of it and would deal with all of it. But for this one moment, she just sat there with her hands flat on the table and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. A hand on her shoulder. Garrick standing behind her, not saying anything because he understood that this was not the moment for words. Across the room, Barrett Kane moved toward the door with Carver at his side, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for a man whose standing has just changed in a room full of people. Not out of respect, but out of the particular discomfort of witnessing a collapse. He did not look at Evelyn as he passed. She watched him go. Emmett appeared at her elbow with Noah, who had apparently decided the proceedings were over and was making it clear he wanted his mother. She took him and held him and stood up from the table, and when she turned around, Gideon Marsh was standing there with his cane, looking at her with his pale eyes. "Well," he said, that's done." "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." "You did the work," he said. "I just knew where things were." He looked at Noah for a moment. "Buy that baby a hat. It's cold out." He went out with the crowd, and Evelyn stood in the emptying courtroom with her son on her hip and Garrick beside her, and the limestone walls of the Denton Crossing courthouse held the particular silence of a place where something real had just occurred. Not a perfect resolution, not a tidy ending, because the prosecutor's review was still ahead, and Barrett Kane was not yet finished as a problem, and Aldridge had already said there would be more paperwork before this was truly settled. But the debt was gone. Daniel's name was cleared, and when they walked out the front doors of the courthouse into the December cold, the sky above the Wyoming Valley was pale and flat and enormous, the way the sky gets in winter out there, and it pressed down on everything with a weight that was somehow not oppressive but clarifying, the way cold air clarifies things that warmth leaves vague. She took a full breath of it. Garrick was beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, looking out at the town with his hat in his hands, and she thought about what he'd said the night before. "I've recently become less patient with that particular habit." And she thought about the horses and the curtains and the night in the kitchen when he'd told her about Margaret in November, and the way he'd said her name in the yard like a full stop that was also, somehow, an opening. There was more to say. There was a great deal more to say. But not here. Not yet. Not in the middle of a courthouse steps with the whole town moving around them, and Emmett loudly declaring to anyone who would listen that he'd known all along it was going to go their way. She looked up at the pale winter sky and let herself believe for the first time in a long time that the thing coming next might actually be worth arriving at. The drive back from Denton Crossing took an hour and a half, and for most of it nobody said much. Emmett had ridden ahead with two of the other hands, loud with relief in the way only young men can be loud, their voices carrying back through the cold air in fragments. Something about Barrett Kane's face when the judge spoke. Something about Marsh and his cane. Something Evelyn couldn't make out that made the others laugh. She was glad for the noise of them. It filled the distance in a way that let her sit beside Garrick on the buckboard without needing to perform anything. Noah had fallen asleep against her chest sometime in the first mile, undone by the warmth and the motion and the general exhaustion of having been held by 7 different people in the space of a morning. She kept one hand on his back and watched the winter valley open up around them as they left town. The flat gray sky, the frost-pale grass, the dark line of the mountains to the west holding their snow with the indifference of things that have been here longer than anything that moves through them. She was thinking about Daniel, not the way she'd been thinking about him for the past 2 months, with the particular focused grief of someone fighting to protect a dead man's name, but differently, quieter. She was thinking about the February he'd spent in that hospital bed, thin and feverish, and how she'd sat beside him for 11 days and read to him from whatever she could find and changed the cold compresses and bargained privately with the universe about what she was willing to give up if he just got better. He had gotten better that time. He'd had 14 more months. They hadn't been easy months. His health was never again what it was. But they'd been months, and she'd had him in them, and that was something. She thought about what Barrett Kane had tried to do to that, had tried to reach back into a dead man's life and rewrite it, turn him into someone careless and dishonest, leave that version of him as the one that stood in the record. The thought of it still made something hot move through her chest, but it hadn't worked. And Daniel Mercer's name was clean. She pressed her hand against Noah's back and felt his small breathing, and she let herself grieve properly for the first time in months. Not perform grief, not manage it, just feel it. And then she let it settle back into the place where it lived, the place that doesn't go away but stops being the only thing. Garrett glanced at her once, didn't ask, looked back at the road. She was grateful for that, too. The prosecutor's review took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, life on the Holloway Ranch moved with the particular rhythm of deep winter. Slower in some ways, more intense in others. The kind of season that requires constant small efforts against the cold that add up to something larger by the time spring comes. Evelyn cooked and managed and repaired and planned, and in the evening she finished the last of the quilts and started on something new. A heavier piece for the bed in the narrow room that she had, without formally deciding to, stopped thinking of as temporary. The men had changed around her in ways that were too gradual to point to, but too complete to miss. Cutter had taken to stopping by the kitchen on Sunday mornings with small offerings. Once a piece of properly seasoned ironwood for the fire, once a jar of wild honey he'd found somewhere and said nothing about, just set on the counter. Holt had started sharing the letters from his mother in Ohio, reading bits of them aloud at breakfast. Not because anyone asked, but because the kitchen had become the kind of room where that felt natural. Even Birch and Cal, who remained mostly opaque to Evelyn's understanding, had each separately performed the significant gesture of remembering how she took her coffee and delivering it correctly without comment. Emmett had become, in all practical terms, Noah's unofficial second person. He'd never formally announced this. It had simply happened through accretion. The carrying, the watching, the patient willingness to make the same ridiculous face 40 times in a row because it made Noah laugh. Noah at 6 months was a person with opinions and a short temper and a laugh that sounded like something being shaken in a jar. And Emmett met all of this with the earnest dedication of someone who had found an unexpected purpose. "He's going to grow up thinking Emmett is his name," Dougal said one morning in January, watching this from the doorway. "He'll figure it out," Evelyn said. "Maybe." Dougal came in and poured his coffee. "Maybe he'll just have 2 names." Garrick said nothing. He was at the table with the ranch accounts open in front of him, though he'd stopped actually looking at the accounts several minutes ago and was watching Emmett walk Noah around the kitchen with the focused attention of a man who thinks nobody is watching him watch. Evelyn saw it. She was becoming fluent in the things Garrick Holloway did not say. The letter from the county prosecutor arrived on a Tuesday in late January. Aldridge brought it himself, which told her it was significant. He sat at the kitchen table and read it to them in his direct way, translating the legal language as he went. Barrett Kane had been formally charged with 2 counts of fraudulent debt claim, with the Mercer case as the primary evidence and the Pruitt claim filed as supporting documentation. Gideon Marsh's testimony had been central to the prosecutor's decision. The charges carried potential civil penalties and the possibility of criminal prosecution if the prosecutor's office chose to pursue the full case. "Will they?" Garrick asked. "Depends on what else they find when they go through his records. They have subpoena authority now. If Kane's been doing this as systematically as it appears..." Aldridge paused. "There may be more families, probably are." He folded the letter. "Either way, his ability to operate in this county is finished. A man with fraud charges pending doesn't have the standing to file debt claims. Every judgment he's gotten will be reviewed." "The Pruitts," Evelyn said. "Potentially recoverable, yes. The East Field." He looked at her. "You did that by coming forward." She thought about William Pruitt in his oversized coat in the courthouse, his steady voice finding itself halfway through and holding. "We did," she said. Aldridge stayed for coffee and then rode back to town, and the kitchen settled into the quiet of a place where something has been resolved, and the resolution is still being absorbed. Garrick sat at the table for a while without speaking. Evelyn washed the cups. "It's done then," he said. "Most of it." She dried her hands. "Aldridge says there may be testimony needed if it goes to criminal prosecution, but that could be a year away, or it might not happen at all. Are you all right with that?" She considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. "The debt is dismissed. Daniel's name is clear. Whatever else happens with Barrett Kane happens with or without me, and either way is a better outcome than where we were in October." She set the towel down. "I'm all right with it." Garrick nodded. He turned the coffee cup in his hands in the way he did when he was thinking something that was taking a while to become words. Evelyn waited, because she'd learned the rhythm of this too. "I need to say something to you," he said. "All right. I've been going back and forth on whether to say it for a while, and I've decided that going back and forth is worse than just saying it." "That's usually true," she said. He looked up at her. "I want you to stay. Not because the kitchen needs running, and not because the men are better with you here, though both of those things are true. I want you to stay because..." He stopped, started again. "I've been running this place for 6 years like it was a thing I was managing rather than a life I was living. And somewhere between October and now, that changed. I don't want to go back to what it was before." The kitchen was warm and quiet. Outside, the January wind pushed against the new window pane that held firm. and the flower sack curtains moved slightly in the draft they'd never completely eliminated. "I'm not talking about an arrangement," he said. "I'm not talking about something practical and convenient. I'm talking about—" He set down the cup. "I'm asking you to stay because I want you here. You and Noah, as family, as—" He made the short, incomplete gesture she'd seen him make before when language wasn't keeping up with what he meant. "I'm not good at this part." "I know," she said. "You're doing all right." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that a yes?" She sat down across from him, looked at the table, at her own hands, at the man across from her who had sold his best horses without making a speech about it, and had held a baby in the dirt of his own yard, and had sat up with her in the cold kitchen the night before the hearing, because he understood that some things don't need to be talked through, just endured together. "It's a yes," she said, "but I want to be clear about something first." He waited. "I'm not staying because I don't have anywhere else to go. I had options. They weren't good options, but they existed." She kept her eyes on him. "I'm staying because I want to be here. Because this place and the people in it have become something real to me. And because you're someone I'd choose, not someone I've settled for." She paused. "I want that said plainly." Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, but it shifted. "It's said," he told her. "Good." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and they sat there for a moment in the warm kitchen, with the wind outside and the sound of Emmett somewhere in the yard making Noah laugh. And it was not a perfect moment. His hand was rough from the cold, and she was still a widow with a dead man's memory in her chest. And there were complicated months ahead with the prosecutor's case, and the question of what came next, and 100 small things that hadn't been worked out. It was not perfect. It was better than perfect. It was real. Spring came to the Wyoming Valley the way it always came. Not as an arrival, but as a slow argument one against winter, 1 degree at a time. The first sign was the mud, which appeared sometime in late February and made the ranch yard into something that required planning to cross. Then the pale green at the edges of the creek banks, fragile and unconvincing until suddenly it wasn't. Then the first calves, arriving in the cold pre-dawn in the way calves always arrived, wet and indignant and requiring attention. Evelyn planted the garden in March. The bed she'd cleared in October, turned and fertilized through the winter, was ready, and she put in what the season and the altitude allowed. Root vegetables, hardy greens, herbs along the south-facing edge where the wall held heat. It was not a large garden. It was the beginning of one. Garrick had been quiet about what he intended to do about the horses. She didn't push. She understood that the loss of Gray Ellis and Red Patience was not something he talked around. It was simply a wound in the ranch's future that sat there, acknowledged without being dramatized. He'd made a decision he believed in and paid the cost of it, and he was not the kind of man who complained about prices he'd agreed to. In April, 2 things happened. The first was the letter from the prosecutor's office, forwarded through Aldridge, informing them that Barrett Kane had entered a negotiated settlement on the civil charges, substantial financial penalties, a consent judgment acknowledging the fraudulent claims, and a permanent bar from filing debt claims in the county. Criminal prosecution had been declined in exchange for the settlement terms, which meant Barrett Kane would not go to prison. Aldridge's letter accompanying the official notice said simply, "This is not everything. It is more than most people in this situation get." Garrick read it at the breakfast table with the men present, which he understood was deliberate. He wanted them to know, wanted it to be a shared thing, because they had all been part of it in ways that mattered. Cutter said, "The Pruitts get their field back?" "The judgment review is underway," Garrick said. "Aldridge thinks it's likely." Cutter nodded once. That was his response. That was enough. The second thing that happened in April was that a man named Hollis Crane rode up from Cheyenne with a young gray mare on a lead line and a letter from the breeder who had bought Gray Ellis. The letter was brief. The breeder had heard, through the channels that information traveled in that world, something of what had happened at the Holloway Ranch over the winter. He was returning the mare, not Red Patience, who had already been sold on, but her full sister, same bloodline, 2 years old and unbroke, at no charge. He wrote that he had daughters of his own and understood certain things about what a debt like the one Garrick had paid was actually worth. Garrick stood in the yard for a long time looking at the mare, who looked back at him with the alert, curious expression of a young horse that has not yet decided what it thinks about anything. Evelyn stood beside him. "She's not read Patience," he said. "No. She's going to need 2 years of work before she's worth what Patience was." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's got good bone structure." "I don't know enough about horses to have an opinion. I'll teach you." He said it simply, the way he said most things, like it was already decided, which she supposed it was. He handed the lead rope to Holt and told him to get the mare settled in the south paddock, and then he looked at Evelyn in the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, directly, without the careful distance that had defined the first weeks, and said, "I'm going to need to find a second stallion. The operation I was building is going to take longer now." "I know. I'm not complaining about that. I know you're not. I just want you to understand what you're staying for. It's not a finished thing. It's a project." She looked at the yard, the barn, the paddocks, the garden bed along the south wall, showing its first tentative green, the house with its flour sack curtains visible in the kitchen window. She looked at Emmett, who was pretending to do something with a fence post while actually watching Noah practice the new and unreliable business of sitting up on his own in the grass. She looked at Cutter coming out of the barn with his coffee and Holt leading the gray mare toward the south paddock, and Dougal's practical shape crossing the yard toward the tool shed. "I know it's not finished," she said. "I'm not looking for finished." Oh. The harvest celebration that fall was the first one the Holloway Ranch had hosted in 7 years. It had been Evelyn's idea, which she'd raised in August with a combination of casualness and determination that Garrick had, by then, learned to recognize as meaning the thing was going to happen whether or not he agreed. He'd agreed because the ranch was in shape for it, and because the men deserved something, and because he'd noticed, over the summer, that he was no longer looking for reasons to keep the world at a manageable distance. They invited the Pruitts, who came with William and his parents, and the slightly dazed quality of people who have recently had something restored to them that they'd stopped believing they'd see again. They invited Aldridge and his wife, and the family from the dry goods store, and a dozen ranching families from the surrounding valley, and Gideon Marsh, who came alone with his ironwood cane and sat in a chair near the barn door and drank 2 cups of cider and watched everything with his pale eyes and appeared to find it satisfactory. There was food. Evelyn had been planning it for 6 weeks, and the kitchen had been operating at full capacity for 2 days. And there was music from a fiddle player named Sorensen, who had a tendency to lose the melody after the 3rd song but made up for it in enthusiasm. And there was the particular quality of noise that a gathered community makes when the gathering is genuine rather than obligatory. Noah, 10 months old and recently in possession of the ability to pull himself upright against furniture, regarded the celebration from the safe position of Emmett's arms, with the expression of someone who has not yet decided whether this much stimulation is desirable. He had grown into a solid, curious child who laughed readily and objected loudly to injustice, and had apparently decided that Garrick was a person of significant interest, a decision he expressed by lunging toward him whenever they were in the same room. Garrick had, after some months of the careful neutrality he'd maintained early on, stopped resisting this. She saw it happen, the moment when Garrick stopped being careful about it, and she thought it was one of the most honest things she'd ever witnessed. Not a declaration, not a gesture, just a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying and not picking it back up. Later in the evening, when the celebration had reached the comfortable stage where people were sitting rather than standing, and the fiddle had gone temporarily quiet, Garrick found Evelyn near the garden wall with a cup of cider in her hand, looking out at the valley in the last of the autumn light. He stood beside her. "William Pruitt told me they broke ground on the east field last week," he said. "I heard." She watched the light on the grass. "His father shook my hand 4 times tonight. I noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "Marsh told me he's been contacted by 2 other families, people who saw the prosecutor's notice and recognized their own situations in it. He's helping them put together their documentation." "Of course he is." "He says he has nothing else to do." "He has plenty to do. He chooses to do this." She looked at Garrick. "Some people decide late what they're for. Doesn't make it less real." He considered this. "Is that a general observation, or are you talking about me?" "Both," she said. "Obviously." He almost smiled. She'd stopped cataloging those almost smiles months ago because they'd become too frequent to track, which was itself a thing she occasionally thought about. How the metrics of a person shift when you stop bracing for them to leave. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "You know. You've been working up to it for 3 days. You went to see Aldridge on Wednesday, which I don't think was about ranch business. You're observant. I told you that in October." She turned to face him. "Ask." He didn't make a production of it. That was consistent with who he was, and she was glad. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the kitchen table in January, directly, without performance, with the particular honesty of a man who has stopped protecting himself from the cost of wanting something. "Marry me," he said, "not because it's practical, not because it's sensible, not because the ranch runs better with two people who respect each other, because I want to build the rest of this with you, because Noah is going to need a father who shows up, and I'm already showing up, because—" He paused. "Because you walked through my door in October with your carpet bag and your hidden baby and your iron spine, and my life has not been the same since, and I don't want it to be." Evelyn looked at him. The evening light was doing something particular to the valley, the last warmth of it going gold and long across the frost-touched grass. And behind them the celebration continued, voices and laughter, and the scrape of a boot on the barn floor, and Noah's voice somewhere in there, his new and earnest attempts at a word that was not quite any word yet, but was trying to be several. "Yes," she said. He nodded, like it was settled, because it was. She reached out and put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it with the same deliberateness he brought to most things. Not impulsive, not romantic in the conventional sense, just entirely certain. They stood there for a while looking at the valley, and the light went, and the stars came in over the mountains with the cold, and somewhere inside the barn Emmett let out a whoop about something that made everyone laugh, and that was enough. More than enough. But there's something people get wrong about starting over. They talk about it like it's a clean break, a line drawn, the old life on one side and the new one on the other, a door that closes and another that opens. But the truth is messier and more honest than that. The old life doesn't disappear. It comes with you. Daniel Mercer came with Evelyn into that kitchen in October, and he was there in the garden she planted, and the receipts she'd sewed into her carpet bag lining, and the way she'd learned to manage accounts, and the particular care she took with things that mattered. Margaret Holloway was in the curtains on the windows, and in the way Garrick checked the paddock gate twice before bed, and in the November he still slept badly, and probably always would. You don't start over, you start forward, carrying what you have, adding to it. Evelyn understood this by the second year on the ranch, when she had a garden that was twice the size of the first one and a daughter of her own. Clara, born in April, small and loud and certain of her opinions from approximately the first hour, and a husband who was still not an easy man but was a good one, which she had come to understand were not the same thing and that the second mattered more. Noah at 2 years old had the run of the ranch in the specific way that children achieve when every adult on a property has collectively decided to keep an eye on them. He called Garrick Da, which had happened without ceremony and without anyone deciding on it, and he called Emmett M, which was either a shortening or a coincidence, and he called Cutter by his full name with a precision that Cutter bore with the dignity of a man who had developed unexpected feelings about a very small person and was not going to discuss it. Garrick had 2 stallions by the 3rd year. The gray mare, he'd named her January, for reasons that required no explanation to Evelyn, had turned out to be everything the breeder had suggested she might be, with the temperament and the bone structure to build something serious, and the operation he'd described as a project was becoming, incrementally and with the constant setbacks that any living thing introduces into plans, something real. Barrett Kane had left the county. Where he'd gone, nobody knew for certain, and very few people cared. The settlement had cost him a significant portion of what he'd built, and the charges and the public proceedings had cost him the standing that had made him effective. And a man like that without standing is just a man with bad habits and a good horse. The Pruitt family had their East Field. Gideon Marsh, in the 2 years following the hearing, had helped 4 other families document and challenge fraudulent claims, all of which resolved in the family's favor. He had, as Evelyn had suggested that evening, found what he was for late and found it completely. He came to Clara's christening, a secular affair held on the ranch with Aldridge doing the honors, which Aldridge seemed to find either touching or peculiar and in any case went along with. And he held the baby with the careful inexperience of a man who does not hold babies often. And he looked at her with his pale eyes for a long moment and said, "She looks suspicious of the whole situation." "She usually does," Garrick said. "Smart," said Marsh, and handed her back. That's it. What Evelyn had believed in the first years after Daniel died was that survival was the thing. Get through, stay standing. Don't let the grief or the poverty or the isolation become the final word. She'd been right about that, as far as it went. Survival matters. Getting through matters. The ability to stay standing when the ground moves is not a small thing. But survival is not the same as living, and she had learned the difference on a Wyoming ranch in the winter of 1888 and had been learning it again every year since. The difference was this. Surviving, you keep your hands close and your expectations low, and you give nothing away that you might need later. Living, you put flour sack curtains on a kitchen window and plant a garden in soil that might freeze before anything grows, and you let a baby grab a stranger's collar, and you don't make him let go. Living costs more than surviving. It costs the thing you've been holding back, the part you decided was too important to risk. And the cost is real. She didn't believe in pretending it wasn't. Garrick had paid it in horses. She had paid it in the decision to knock on a door she had no right to expect to open. Emmett paid it every morning in the ridiculous face he made to get Noah to laugh. Cutter paid it in honey jars and ironwood and the complicated loyalty of a man who had loved a place long enough to love the people in it. None of it was without cost. None of it was without risk. None of it had gone smoothly or resolved itself without the kind of friction that left marks. But the ranch was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Not just operating, alive. There was noise in it, and argument, and the specific mess of people actually inhabiting a place rather than just moving through it. There was a kitchen that smelled like something and a garden that was changing year by year and a child learning to walk on floors that had been swept by a woman who had arrived in October with $43 and a hidden baby and no guarantee of anything. And in the evening, sometimes when the work was done and Clara was asleep and Noah had been chased to bed and the men had gone to the bunkhouse, Garrick and Evelyn would sit at the kitchen table with whatever needed doing, mending, accounts, the correspondence that a ranch generated, and not say much, and that was the best part. Not because they had nothing to say to each other, because they'd said the things that needed saying and built something that didn't require constant explaining, that just existed, solid and imperfect and theirs. Outside, the Wyoming Valley went on being what it had always been, big and cold and indifferent in the way that land is indifferent, not cruel, just older than anything that walks across it. The mountains held their snow, the creek ran in its season, the grass came back every spring with the same slow argument, and in the Holloway ranch house, the flour sack curtains moved in the draft that the new window pane had never quite eliminated. The way some things persist, not because you haven't tried to fix them, but because they're just the nature of the thing, and you learn to live with them, and after a while you stop noticing, and after a while longer you'd miss them if they were gone.